Hello, everybody, and welcome to Our World Today, the Unionist perspective. Today, we're looking at the topic of China from a much deeper inspection lens, given some of the news that we've seen in terms of China's economy and also their relationship with quite a few countries, but also in terms of the internal relations and what that really has, how that impacts the people of China and generally the people across the globe that in some or other form have a relationship with China that might mean imminent challenges for them if China's economy goes into a collapse, which is what is starting to be highlighted with reduction in the economic growth, the GDP reduction, things happening in the housing and property market. Also, there was a lot of conversation around loans being pulled back from property developers. So there's a lot of challenge in terms of what is happening internally with China and what that would entail should that decline start to really touch the economies of most other countries that have economic relations with them. So I'm going to open it up to the team and we're going to just flow with where the conversation takes us today.
Yeah, so I guess to go a little bit into like summarizing the details of what's going on with China. I don't remember the exact percentages here, but I think it was like about a third of their economy, like of their GDP is real estate. And then I think it was like 20% was manufacturing, but I'm not confident on that. So if you guys could correct me if you happen to remember. But already it's at least 20%, I remember, based on the numbers that are going around in my head. So that's at least in 50% of the economy, they're having a slowdown or they're having like a loss of value or a collapse of value. And we've been talking about it, but just to bring people up to speed if they don't know, in the real estate sector, the problem was that China was basically, the development companies were basically buying way too much land and developing way too many apartments. And so thinking that they would be like valued really highly, and basically it turned out that there wasn't near enough demand. And the thing is that China, like by having all of this massive development, they could create an illusion of their economy being bigger than it really was, essentially. And so you had people buying these apartments often before they were even finished, or condos, I guess they would be. And they end up like losing their value because people, the market starts to realize, hey, like all of this housing isn't as valuable as we thought because there's not as much demand as we thought. And so that's been really affecting people. And also just companies like running out of money to even finish these apartments. So people stop paying for them because you're paying for something that's not finished or maybe not going to be. So we've been talking about that and how that's sort of led that part of the economy to start collapsing. And then I believe the manufacturing issue is like partly influenced by that and also influenced by other countries wanting to be more like protectionistic, and probably because like the energy I feel is more like, without knowing the facts about it, I feel the energy is more like countries want to be more picky and selective about like what other countries they associate with. Just been a big theme for us with Russia and also China. So yeah, I feel that. And yeah, that's basically my little summary. Yeah. And my thoughts on it.
You were correct on the numbers. It's actually a third of the economy for real estate and 20% on manufacturer. And I guess I'm going to go into the external economy because you've made a great summary of the internal. And basically, after the end of zero COVID policy, Wall Street and all the stock markets were expecting China to explode again, like it did for most of 20 years, 25 years, in terms of economy, and that didn't happen. But progress has been still, it's been like non-remarkable, and it's kind of going into a slowdown right now. And I think that's why people are starting to understand that, hey, maybe like that's a bad deal, and how it impacts us and other people is that everything that we manufacture in China is probably going to collapse as well. We're going to feel the impact of it. And yeah, there's something about like not being really, I feel like there's something about being disconnected, China being disconnected from its people, leading into like a real estate crisis on the market and other things. President Xi not being connected to its people either because he's going into, is like doubling down into his policy of like, into a policy that probably is going to make China collapse, even though there are things that he can do that could renew the economy and its energy in a very good way, but that are not his like political views for the country. So we won't do that. And also a disconnectedness from the world and how much of a bad deal it was to do with China in some places in the market, and basically already kind of feeling the brunt of it in at Wall Street, for example, and for some countries that are like, you know, fast enough to and have money enough to retrieve parts of their economy back inside instead of like going to China or going to other countries that have lesser bad deals in that space. And so there is a lot of basically like what the situation of a crisis is highlighting, and where the spiritual lesson is that you're going to see all the places where there were like mishaps, misunderstandings, no transparency, and all these things that feel disconnected, and that's why it's spiritual. And you're going to see it everywhere, and no country is going to be out of it because that's what a crisis is. And I wasn't expected to go that way, but I feel like there's like the spiritual lesson in this crisis, and maybe sometimes there's a real incentive in the crisis for human beings who don't know how to change out of a crisis to really make that change finally, you know. And so that's why all the disconnection, the feelings of like empty, of like there's a big gap between what was expected and what is happening, is being felt by so many people right now, and will continue to be felt if China and when China continues to make the same choices, you know.
I feel like it's the story about China is bringing up a lot of things about partnerships and, you know, how to either like create healthy partnerships or unhealthy partnerships. And Jeff in the Discord discussion talked about how, like after the fall of the dynasties, they kind of shifted to communism and, started partnering with like Western countries. But instead of China focusing on like the partnership with other countries, they kind of focus all their effort on communism and kind of like became a shell within themselves. And that like the consequences that we're seeing of like this unhealthy economy that doesn't like create things that people actually use and appreciate. It just creates a bunch of like things that people either don't need or can't afford. And I feel like for the global consequences, which have also, like we've talked about in the Discord chat, of just like what's going to happen to the countries that are partnering with China, knowing that, it may not be a good bet, because there's like the US, for example, like so much of our exported things come from China. Like everything in this country is basically made in China. And so I don't know how you guys feel about like is the spiritual lesson about partnership and understanding how to go about that, or what?
So I have to agree with you that there's definitely a partnership angle, but I feel like the partnership angle literally speaks to trading in truth. So it's literally kind of the difference between having a relationship where there's total honesty versus having a relationship where things are hidden. And unfortunately, in this instance, in the relationship with China, a lot of things have been hidden. And one of those things literally just even speaks to its own population, in that there was a big boom in building properties, which people believed would be the way to secure their futures, to have something in their married life and in just to create wealth in their family. And almost trading at the expense of your own people starts to tell us that there's a problem with the relationship. Trading at the expense of one, overbuilding or building subpar, but overpricing it, starts to tell you that it's an abusive relationship. It's a relationship where there isn't really fairness, or almost, it's almost not even fairness. It's just this true cohesion. There's a lot of take, but not very much reciprocation. And what we saw was the housing market implode. And for the reason that a lot of properties were developed on the back of loans, and when the economy took a dive, those loans were recalled. So one, they took early property deposits and things like that from their people, but delivered nothing. They couldn't service their loans, which had I don't think it was the construction bank or something like that, pull back their loans, change their top leadership structure because the way loans were issued and the return on those loans wasn't forthcoming. So that's according to, and with the number that Sage quoted on 30% of the economy is based on the property market, you can immediately see the significant gap created, because literally there was no fair value, because literally an economy works on fair value. You pay fair value for the good or the service that you receive, that you want. And that is what keeps the economy running. So if something is overpriced, there's going to be less of a demand. If things are subpar, there's going to be less of a demand. Flooding the market with goods at less of a demand, but expecting a higher price, was never going to make economical sense. And I think that, that equation that we need to understand in how economies work, and it's something that we spoke to earlier, Andrea, where, the concept of sharing, the concept of building, sharing, appreciating, there has to be fair value in that relationship for an economy to thrive. So if you're getting fair value, you're going to be joyful about what you're getting. Yes, it might be a necessity purchase, but you're still going to be joyful about receiving the value or fair value for your money spent. And I think that's where the danger sits right now for China. So internally, they're imploding, which is always going to be the situation of the roots of a tree that doesn't burrow down, but burrows outwards. So and let's be honest, what do the roots of a tree do? They suck up water. And it's sucking up water in the fact that it's spreading out as opposed to spreading down and going deep.
In what you're saying, Randall, there's something that speaks very much to arrogance in that relationship. And so no partnership is possible in that space. And so this arrogance is like, people in China, Chinese people are paying the price of it. For example, the poorest regions of the country are already experiencing this financial hardships, and they were in that market of real estate too, because they made money out of it. But the people are the first to suffer about it, and most of the younger generation doesn't even have work opportunities. So it's another thing where there's arrogance at the detriment of your people. And we see this too with the US and with West, basically, and that's how I see it. You mentioned that instead of focusing on the West or their relationship with the West, they focused on communism, but it's more than that. It was more in the sense of, like Jeff mentioned, it being that China doesn't even recognize how much the West helped create that Chinese miracle. And so in this space, that's why President Xi is always going to double down on this politic that doesn't serve the economy, because he's basically saying that China and communism have rebuilt the country and made the country the power that it is right now, instead of the relationship with the world has made China the country that it is right now. And that's a big, big difference. A big difference that makes it so the relationship feels rotten, and you can't have a relationship with someone, or you have a very, very bad relationship and you both lose in that case. That's exactly like a toxic person in your life. So in my opinion, you can't even have a relationship with someone in that space. And that's not even the whole of the relationship. There were plenty of components that made it so like it was a bad deal between the US and China, but it's not even, it's really at the core of China. It's for them to heal. It's like the arrogance that is like making their people suffer and being depressed and producing a depressed economy, and that is producing depression in relationships with others too, in my opinion.
And one note, I feel like that's reflected because the article mentioned that like 37% of the Chinese economy is based on consumer consumption compared to like, 70% that we see in the US. So all of it is either like exports or property. So I feel like that's just like another indication that they're like not really investing in what the people need. And like you said, Irene, it's like a very like arrogant, like selfish, greedy sort of energy.
Yeah, it's kind of like expecting. No, it's like first it's like a sum up of like all these little things that make it really bad, and also they were kind of expecting consumer consumption to pick up from itself without doing anything, and still profiting off of loans and the real estate market. And that didn't happen, obviously, because that's people are not going to just buy just because you open the market again. That doesn't make sense. Like, obviously there's going to be a boom for everyone, but they passed that boom by 2 years because they opened 2 years after everyone. And also because like in these 2 years so many things happened to just like make people feel like they were bummed out, instead of having a boom and like a thriving, a joy, an explosive expansion inside of them. Like, it's not going to work like that. And it's just a lesson for them. I feel like that's not something that you necessarily know from the get-go, but there's definitely a lesson about like, hey, you need to treat people right, otherwise we're not going to give back to you. That's a relationship. But they're not choosing to learn either from that space where their people are basically showing them what's missing.
And I think you touched on a very important point in terms of, so there was this expectation that trade from a consumption point of view would pick up. But let's just understand what the consumption has done. The consumption of their property market has left a sour taste in the mouth of the consumer. It's highly unlikely that a consumer is going to trust the market as easily, but also they don't have the economic resources to go back into the market wholesale the way they have before, because significant sums of their money was wrapped up in property. So it's a dual-edged sword where what is required is for economic consumption within the country. There is no money available for that economic consumption. So there's a lot of gap left in the market. Then we have to consider that COVID has slowed down the economies of most countries. So not only is there a slowdown of consumption in the Chinese economy from their own consumers, there's a global slowdown of consumption. And so that almost projected boom after reopening economies was ill-advised in the first place. The projection should have probably been more considered. They should, it should have been the situation of a much more conservative projection, because everybody is feeling the pain of economic slowdown.
Almost feels like Wall Street was expecting China to be the savior there of a slowing down economy, of a pain. Obviously, that's not healthy.
Yes, and so in that unhealthy expectation, they were going to be disappointed, because literally the projection was not realistic. It could not possibly have boomed in the way it did before.
Yeah, and so that's like a big feature too of ego too that you guys are talking about is that it always promises you're good later. And so it's like, if you just like do this now, like this, like not good feeling thing now, then you'll get your good later. And that's a big issue because there's a difference between like making an investment that you have reasonable confidence will pay off and being like, I hope this is going to pay off, but let's just like go all in, and then we are gonna people are going to like go crazy about this because we're projecting so much confidence. That's way different than like making an investment where there's some risk of loss, but like you're pretty confident that it will pay off, you know, and if not, like you kind of hedge your bets. And that's kind of their foreign policy too, like when they loaned out like $1 trillion+ to all of these countries that probably couldn't pay these loans back with the secret intention of seizing the country's assets in order to repay, in order to get the loans repaid. Like thinking like, this may seem like this really unwise move, but like, don't worry, like it's gonna pay off, it's gonna pay off. And it seemed like a really big, like, I guess, victory, if there's a, like, in a sense, like, for example, in Tajikistan, like, they seized, like, the largest gold mine in Tajikistan because the Tajik government defaulted on the debt. So they said, we'll just take your gold mine if you don't mind. Like, that settles the debt, you know, we're good, you know, we'll be nice. And it's just like, wow, like, you literally did that because Tajikistan was, like, desperate to get credit extended to them. You literally did that deliberately. And then it just comes back to bite them because you gave them all this money, but it didn't pay back and they didn't pay you back. And, you know, it's just, that's the situation that they created, you know? And so the same thing that they were trying to do to others, they were doing to themselves and their own people. So yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's just like China is not a team player, thinking that it can like survive on its own, but it's like everyone is paying for not being connected, not being a team player. And that also makes me think of like the other news that we're going to talk about, and especially Juneteenth, and the fact that when Juneteenth was established after George Floyd's murder, it was expected to be a big celebration of connectedness between the population that celebrated Juneteenth already and the population that needed to be aware of it and maybe come to this observation that, hey, like, we need to recognize what is happening there, what is happening to everyone. And that's why it was a national celebration, made a national celebration by Biden. But I think Sage mentioned that it's not so much a national celebration. It's more like turning into what we can call like capitalization, commercialization of a celebration of a holiday. And I wonder, I'm just curious, like, from what you saw, Sage, how are the African American like feeling about Juneteenth at this time?
I feel like based on like what I've been reading, there's a combination of feelings about it, you know, like, for example, like the woman who sought to like get Juneteenth recognized as a national holiday. Like, she felt like she wanted people to be educated about it, like about when slavery actually ended, and to commemorate it, you know, in a way that is dignified and like respectful. So I think there is that desire of like more people recognizing like how important this is and everything. But there's also, yeah, just this feeling of like basically rainbow capitalism is happening here. And that's a term that originated with pride, like, so with LGBT pride, like it being Pride Month, it's like cool to talk about this. It's interesting too, they like coincide, you know. Juneteenth is also in June, which is Pride Month. And yeah, the rainbow capitalism, it's basically like a company, like Bud Light is an excellent example of this, like slap a rainbow on it and now it's gay themed. And we are appealing to, you know, the gays and them other letters in the acronym. Like that's basically in the executive boards, like that's the vibe. Okay. Like we know that's the vibe because you can just like smell it. You're just like, okay, like a rainbow's been added here. Nice. I feel seen. But you don't feel seen. You don't, unless a company has like very genuine intent there. It's a double-edged sword is what we're getting at, because yes, it does increase visibility, but it does so in a way that can be very I don't know how to put this, like it kind of makes it more superficial. So you got like in the article we read, it was like Walmart had like this Juneteenth themed like ice cream and put these like typically like African colors on it, like the red, yellow, and green and black colors. And like they didn't even know that Juneteenth uses red, white, and blue. You know, there's kind of like a riffing and a theme on like the Texan flag and the American flag. And it also reminds me of the Haitian flag, you know, since they achieved liberation from slavery. And so that wasn't even known. Like there's all of these things, and it's just a really typical thing like in the US. And for us, like if someone is introduced to Juneteenth and they don't know about it and what it really means, they may not know the solemnity of it, the solemnness of it. I think that's the right word, because it is in part, it's a great celebration, but it's also a solemn recognition of what the African American community went through in the country's history, you know, and saying, hey, like slavery, like was like 160 years ago, you know, a little less. So that needs to be acknowledged, and just being like, yeah, like party, holiday, we get the day off. Woo. It's like, okay, but there's something deeper there than that, you know? So that's everything I read about it. Like that was my feelings about it. Yeah.
I really like what you said. I think there was also something that really touched me in her testimonial of Juneteenth. It was basically that they would come together, they would cook a certain type of food, they would do certain activities and things like that. It's not even, actually, they don't even want people to go into history lessons on a holiday. This pretty much felt to me like a kind of like a Thanksgiving, like revered, like a Thanksgiving holiday, because it's all about like getting together in the memory of what happened and just respecting the traditions. And maybe she was trying to establish a tradition, but a tradition, it takes time to be established, I guess. And that's one thing she was disappointed on. And then there was this thing about like rainbow flagging, whatever the companies are doing with like just putting a flag on Instagram and be done with it and be gone. And I feel like there's something deeper. There's something about like for a tradition to be established, like I don't think she was expecting it to be a strong celebration nationwide for all people in the span of 2 years. But in order for a tradition to be established, like you kind of have to go into like actually remembering it, you know, every year. And we talked about it with my brother somehow. It came to the table even before we talked about this discussion. I was like, oh my God, they got Kamala Harris out for Juneteenth, and just for Juneteenth. We haven't seen her for anything except NASA and Juneteenth this year. And we were talking about that. And like, how are you going to call people into a celebration and a tradition when things are done half-assed or just for a community? You made the national holiday, but you're still calling to a community. And I think personally, for some monarchies, like many things on every US holiday, basically, I haven't seen Juneteenth at all. And I don't think that's the fault of the people that wanted to celebrate Juneteenth. It's something about like, we put a blind on it, we put some, I don't know, a pat on the back of like, you know, we're going to make a celebration and then we didn't follow through, or we aren't following through just yet, which is like, we're still in the building of tradition. So, but in order for it to actually become a tradition, we have to recognize that there were some years where we needed to change some things. And I think that's what the article was about. And I think it's important.
So I think you touch on something very important in terms of creating a tradition. And so the challenge with the situation is that you cannot celebrate something or commemorate something if you don't acknowledge that it stemmed from a problem in the first place. So the challenge here is that under many circumstances, the Black struggle has been removed out of popular literature. Lots of things have been whitewashed. We've spoken about cultural appropriation and things like that. South Africa has a very similar thing to Juneteenth in that we celebrate June the 16th as Youth Day, but it's commemoration of the death of a youth during the struggle. And so Pride Month and Youth Month coincide in June, just the way it does in the States. But there's a very big focus on youth. But it's still, you know, you can't celebrate a win when you don't even acknowledge that you came from it. The win came out of a struggle, out of a problem. So of course, you're going to have this appropriation of a national holiday as a fabulous time to party. And yes, we commemorate that it's Youth Day, but also the majority of South Africa is also on this page of, yay, June the 16th, public holiday, let's all have fun. We have the Comrades Ultra Marathon that's run around that time. So it kind of brings focus to it, but it's not focused on youth. And I think that's the challenge here. It's like this rainbow washing of merchandise and storefronts and all those things. Nothing is really being done for the LGBTQ plus community during that time. Nothing is being done for the Black community during that time. Nothing is being done to bolster youth, to provide opportunities to show how big corporates and government are actually doing something to uplift youth during Youth Month. So for as long as we treat it as a party, and not acknowledge where we came from, we are never going to establish a tradition of saying this time of the year is specifically focused on uplifting those communities more than any other time of the year, because it shouldn't only be that snapshot once-off thing when it's Pride Month or Youth Month or Black History Month. And that's the challenge. The challenge is it's been literally co-opted into everything but what it's meant to commemorate and to really give effort and energy to.
Yeah,
I
I
totally-
totally agree. Were we just gonna say the same thing? I think we did.
Go ahead,
I love what you just said, Granville, because I was sitting here thinking, you know, why is the deeper meaning of these holidays not acknowledged, or why is that not really the energy of what happens with these holidays? And I think it's exactly what you just said, that that the deeper meaning really, it needs to be acknowledged by everyone, and that needs to be accepted. That needs to be the main reason for having it, and the awareness needs to be there for everyone that is celebrating. And because, like, I think for Juneteenth and for Pride, like the history that's there's so much history, and the majority of people who want to celebrate or acknowledge the holiday don't really like feel into or understand like the depth that's there, you know. But if that were to happen, I think it would be celebrated properly.
Yeah, I was gonna say pretty much the same thing. And you know, because I've heard the same thing with like Martin Luther King Day. It's always like, you know, classes are canceled, no one's working, it's a whole, you know, party, but like no one really sits and thinks about like, well, what can I do today to, you know, maybe honor his legacy or honor the work or his, you know, his whole purpose. And same thing with like you said, Black History Month, Women's History Month. And I feel like this also is kind of touching upon the article about African American women's health, you know, because like you have all these holidays, so like Black History Month, Juneteenth, Martin Luther King, as a way, you know, I guess like politically to like try to rectify things. But that when you look at the reality, we see that still in the United States, it's still a reality that like African American women many times do not receive the sort of healthcare, equal healthcare, compared to like, you know, their white counterparts. The same can be said for people in the LGBTQ community, especially like trans women, trans men, like just getting access to basic needs that everyone, like that is a human right that everyone deserves. You know, there's such a huge disconnect, and there's like this weird infatuation for making holidays, but not necessarily like really trying to get at the core and try to understand and rectify, like, why are we even having this? Like, who cares if Chuck Schumer says Juneteenth, where, you know, it's a great idea? Like, what does that even mean if it's just an excuse for people to like get drunk all day and, you know, have barbecues, which is fine, like do it, but also think about why, you know, why you're able to do those things, or like, you know, why we have that day off. So
I was thinking exactly the same, like, why holidays? What? What's the meaning of those, and how do we bring deep meaning in this? And that's not an easy question, because like it feels like holidays are inherited from the church, from religions, and I deeply respect that. And there's something very spiritual about like a lot of holidays, but there is also something very work, not work, then party about adding holidays nowadays. And it's like, well, we inherited holidays for a deep, meaningful reason, but we're not really using that as a deep, meaningful reason. Right now, it's just about like not working, you know. Obviously, not working is nice, I guess. You know, you can party, you can stay at home, things like that. But yeah, holidays. Like, I don't know. I don't even think like it has the same meaning in church anymore. Even for Christians, it's not the same as before. And so there is I think it speaks to a lack of getting deep into feelings that don't feel good, but for the whole of humanity. Like, it's not just the US, it's everywhere. And it's not just related to Juneteenth. Like, that's not something about, I don't think that's necessarily something about not wanting to do the work for minorities in that space of holidays, you know? It's more about like, we don't dig deep and we're trying to find God, but we're trying to find God in like places that don't really make sense. And so we celebrate and we pay homage in the only way we know, which is capitalism. And again, it's not a bad thing, but that's not it's not even about intention. I feel it's more about like confusion on what life actually is about, and misdirection, I guess. And that misdirection blinds us from the actual problems of, like, for example, African women's health and the difference of treatment between men and women and transgender people in healthcare and pregnancy and the dangers of pregnancy applied to several ethnicity. So, yeah.
Do we want to talk more about the healthcare issue?
I do, yeah. Yeah, again, it feels like very well-known Olympic medalists had to speak up on this issue for people to actually kind of start to care, even though we've been talking about the gap in African American women's healthcare for like at least 2 years and more for people who have been on these cases for a while. I didn't even know that pregnancy, I don't know if it's only African American or it's like Black women in general, but I didn't even know that pregnancy was that much more dangerous for us. Or maybe like treatment of side effects are more handled in other countries, and so we don't actually have to worry about that. But it's kind of sad that we had to witness a tragic event of like a 32-year-old dying for people to actually say like, okay, what was wrong with her? Oh, she suffered like side effects from pregnancy and actually led to her death. Like, wow, you know.
Yeah, and it always seems to be things that are like preventable, like, or at least manageable, you know, like high blood pressure or preeclampsia, you know, like those things, they should not lead to, in this day and age, anyone dying. But, you know, the fact that like the mortality rate for Black women is 2.6 times that of, the maternal mortality rate for Black women is 2.6 times the rate for white women, according to the CDC. I mean, I feel like it's just further emphasizing like what we were talking about, like the sort of historical systematic things that have led to this. And, you know, like recently, I feel like Beyonce and like Serena Williams, they've kind of brought these things to the forefront, like using their, you know, their position and their power. but it's like I feel like doctors, they have their prejudice of Black women, and you know, I don't really understand where it comes from, but it's like this. I've read things about like there's just like this assumption that like they don't feel pain in the same way, you know, which I think stems from like slavery days, like thinking that somehow they're different, that, you know, they're not human, therefore, you know, they can just be out in the fields all day doing these things and they're going to be fine. But like white women, oh, we have to protect them, we have to take care of them because they're weaker or whatever. And so
Right.
and then like in combination, like just access to better healthcare, you know, the fact that like, at least in this country, race and poverty are very much correlated. There's an overrepresentation of, you know, people of color in like lower income brackets. It also means that on average, you know, Black women may not have access to the same quality healthcare as white women do.
Right. And even when they have the means, like people are saying they're exaggerating. Serena Williams showing up in a suit that actually like preserves her life and health while she comes back to tennis after giving birth, and all the backlash that she actually had from it was like terrible. And I remember we spoke about that in Black Lives Matter discussion. And I just feel like I just realized like my parents are like doctors and from the medical health center. I don't think I've lived on a mixed island for like my 18 years. I don't think white women or Indian women have less swollen feet or when they're pregnant. So it's actually about like, there's this thing about like Black women are treating their swollen feet themselves instead of like doctors saying actually, oh, there's a problem, just as like they would say for white women during pregnancy, just because like it feels like more of a mistreatment of the body. And obviously like that's something to heal within us, because like I don't think people are saying, I see a lot of Black women saying, oh, swollen feet, and then it will just pass, like, and don't have to go to a doctor, or maybe like it's not too bad. So obviously it's two sides of the same coin, but it definitely feels like more than being something hormonal in a specific ethnicity, because I wasn't aware of like anything being really that different between our ethnicities for pregnancy. I think it's more about like this thing about African American women, and just like, oh, you know, they'll survive, or we see more of them with swollen feet, so that must be okay. That must be something that comes with the race, where actually it's not normal that they have swollen feet. It's just not treated. And yeah, that's all I wanted to say on this, but that's pretty bad.
So I think there's another thing, and we spoke about this in the Black Lives Matter conversation as well. I remember literally the almost veritable shitstorm that Naomi Osaka had in terms of withdrawing from some or other tournament due to mental health reasons, and that was also quite a thing. But what I actually also wanted to just bring us back to is that there is going to be a higher prevalence of symptoms showing up in a bigger portion of the population. For South Africa, that bigger portion of the population will happen to be Black. Doesn't mean that they're more prone to it, but it also doesn't mean that they don't need the help. Part of the challenge I find with how we treat health as people of color is that we have a lot of anecdotal stories that are passed down from generation to generation. So as opposed to somebody going to a doctor to treat their high blood pressure, some person will have a story about, oh, you know, my mother just used to mix 2 teaspoons of turmeric in a glass of water and drink that, and it would drop her blood pressure.
Exactly.
Yes, it dropped her blood pressure, but she also dropped down sooner than if she had gone and seen a doctor. You know, so it's not just the misperception of people that are not of color. It's also the misperception of people of color not wanting to ask for help in certain respects because we have these anecdotal stories that have been passed down and we treat it as traditional wisdom, where we actually need to also accept that sometimes our bodies need medical help.
Yep.
So it's kind of a dual-edged sword, and there has to be a happy medium. But I also agree with Andrea that there is still a significant lack of access to those kind of resources for people of color.
What I was feeling from this story and from the last story that we were talking about too is that you know, as LGBT people or for people of color, it's this feeling of like taking yourself seriously or taking or like valuing yourself. And I feel like that's like that's at the core what needs to be healed for like both for like Juneteenth Pride and for also like the medical and the healthcare. It's also for the groups of people and individuals to choose to value themselves or take that seriously or like take our own history or our own healthcare seriously and value that as well, because then we would also see that reflected more, I feel too.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to interpret. I feel like that athlete, when she sat down after the death of her friend and talked about that with her family, there was like someone that said, "Oh, I experienced this during my pregnancy, but I thought it was nothing." And the second woman was saying the same thing, and third and fourth, until it was her. And like 5 women at the table had experienced the same thing, but didn't know. And there's that dual-edged sword about like no one told them about that and pregnancy, but there's also something about like, oh, it must be nothing, you know, that sentence that is always there. I see that in Indian communities too, but basically, as all of you said, it's a problem of people of color and just like homemade remedies or spirituality being passed down, but also not being, you know, you need to include Western medicine sometimes, you know. Experiencing upheaval to the point of fainting several times a day, go see a doctor. I see that with my clients too, and I'm like, you know, that's not a shame. Like, go see your doctor, even if it doesn't say anything, but still check. That's important.
So I think you're touching on something important as well. Is also this level of misplaced pride and this shame around needing help, but also the almost lack of sharing. So, you know, you will find that a lot of these things happen quite often, but because we are ashamed of the condition, we might not want to share it. But somebody else may have experienced exactly that same condition and had to get to a doctor that was able to assist them. So I think there's also this, you know, like, it's like, again, it's this dual-edged thing. Like, how far do we go into truly relating to each other? And how far do we go into truly honoring our existence and our healthcare needs and our individual rights and all of those things? And it literally, it comes back to this thing that Isaiah was sharing around honoring and truly respecting yourself so that you do seek the assistance that you need when you need it. Everything is not outside of you, but there are certain conditions that unfortunately have to be treated outside of you until you learn the spiritual lesson that you are a healed being. Okay, and with that, we have reached our hour. So I'm going to say thank you to everybody for the conversation. To everybody that's followed us, please also feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, where you'll find all our previous conversations. And we will look forward to seeing all of you next week. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Uh,